Hi, Dwight. I was hoping you could introduce yourself to the audience and talk a little bit about what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the invitation. Really happy to be here. This is my first ever recorded podcast recording with video, I think, so this will be fun. Dwight Stoll, professor of chemistry at Gustavus Adolphus College, which is a small private liberal arts college in southern Minnesota. And here I teach primarily analytical chemistry courses and run a research program with almost exclusively undergraduates focused on liquid chromatography and especially liquid chromatography. You see these tons of sports podcasts these days, and it's weird when they interview each other, the podcast host. But now we're doing that, so we'll see how it goes.
Absolutely. What inspired your team to double down on the idea that the chromatography community needs more retention data for machine learning and just AI applications in general? And I was curious if there was a specific aha moment that really led to that for your team.
Yeah, so it's the story as I think about it is really goes back. I would say I sort of trace the roots of our thinking today maybe 20-ish years or so, because it starts for us with my involvement starting in the mid 2000s with the work of Lloyd Snyder and John Dolan and Pete Carr on this so-called hydrophobic subtraction model of reverse phase selectivity. At that time I was a user of it, but I wasn't sort of deeply involved. And then when I moved here, shortly after I moved here to Gustavus in 2008, Lloyd and John approached me and said, "Hey, we're going to retire soon. We don't want this project to die. Would you be interested in sort of carrying it forward?" And a big piece of that was going to be continuing to make measurements to characterize new columns so that the data could go into the database. And I said, "Yeah, sure, that sounds fun." And so in the early 2010s, we kind of made that transition of the characterization work from their lab to my lab. And then so as I kind of became the face, I suppose, of the model for people out in the wild, I was just repeatedly getting the question, well, this model's nice, but can we use it to predict anything? And for several years I said, well, that's not really what it was made for, and didn't really do anything about it. And then in the late 2010s, I finally asked a student, I said, let's just answer the question, can it be used to predict anything? And for us, the anything at that time was just answering the question, how good is the model at predicting the retentions or selectivities of the probe molecules that we actually use for the characterization, which is only about 15 molecules. To make a pretty long story really short, what we found there is that the model did pretty well for, let's say, C18 type stationary phases. I call them plain vanilla C18s, but it was really bad for C18 type phases. So PFPs and polar embedded phases and things like that. And I think we have to be careful not to sort of over criticize the model, because originally that was how the model was built, is on C18 data. And so in a way we were asking the model to do something that it really wasn't built to do, but it at least told us at that point, yeah, if you want to predict something for a C18, it has a chance, but for anything else, it's not going to be very accurate. So then we said, well, how about if we take all the data that's been collected since then, so the last 15 years at that point, and essentially refine or reparameterize the model and see how much better it does, or if it does any better. And it turned out it did quite a bit better, and especially in the sense of the number of really gross errors, like errors bigger than 10%. And so this was kind of, for me, I would say it wasn't like one moment at my desk, but it was certainly over a period of maybe a few weeks. I was like, wow, this tells us we can do a lot better if we just have more data, and more data that um, reflect the diversity of stationary phases that we have in the pool. I think any data scientist or statistician would tell you, well, of course that's the case. But it was a major realization. So then at that point, so we called the model, this refined model, HSM2. I guess we're not very creative. And then at that point, we really started to think about, well, okay, so if we need more data, it's either going to take 20 years or we needed to figure out how to do it a lot faster than what we've been doing it. And so it was at more or less around that time that we started looking into how to use really short columns to make measurements faster. And that was also kind of a realization, like, why haven't we been doing this for the last 20 years? And so we've invested a lot of time in that approach. And I think it's been quite fruitful, and we're excited about the future.
That's great to hear. Now, I know this is a big, giant question, but how do you see AI transforming chromatography in the next 5 to 10 years? And what role does the high quality retention data play in that transformation?
Yeah. So I think it depends on how you define AI. The way I talk about it, especially with students, is I say that one of the holy grails of chromatography is predicting retention from structures of molecules, right? This is what everyone wants to do because there's just an enormous amount of time and energy and resource spent today doing essentially trial and error experiments, right? I got 10 new molecules. I don't know how to separate them. So let's just go into the lab and do something and see what happens. And, so what we'd really like to do instead is say, feed those structures into some model and then have it give us at least a starting point. And then we can go to the lab and refine. So I think we're seeing the beginnings of that already. We're already in the 2010s, a few papers here and there, people trying to do that with, varied levels of success. But what I see from talking with mostly big pharma companies about this is that they're doing it already at some level and they're seeing that it's impacting their business. So, of course, they're getting very serious about it, really investing in it now. And I think just in the last maybe year or so, there's been 6 or 8 pretty impactful papers in this space. So I think things are really heating up and it's going to be pretty exciting to see how things develop. In my mind, there's no question at all that this will be done. So you call it, again, it sort of depends on the terms and the names you use. Is it machine learning? Is it AI? Whatever. But people are doing it and they will be doing it. To me, the questions that remain are really, what is the scope of these models, right? So in the HSM database at the moment, we have data for almost 800 columns. Is there going to be a model that can make predictions for all of those columns or more? I mean, there's something like 1,300 commercially available reverse phase columns. Or is it going to be a subset of those? And if it's a subset, who's going to choose what that subset is? And I think there's actually some parallels to what we see happening in the generative AI space, OpenAI, Gemini, and so on. Are the models going to be closed? Are they going to be open? How good are they? That is, what level of accuracy should we as users expect? Because I say to students, like, we can make a prediction today. Anybody can make a prediction today. It doesn't mean it's any good for anything. So that is one of the big questions: is what is the level of accuracy going to be, and given that level of accuracy, what what parts of chromatography can we use it for? Because there's many applications that are actually very forgiving, and there are others that are much more demanding. So I think where we land in terms of the accuracy is really going to depend on how people use it. There are, I think, some in the work that we've been doing in the past few years to generate a lot more data. We've started to see some things that I think of as really some big limitations in this space that I don't see anyone talking about. And so we've kind of been thinking about, should we write some sort of white paper, opinion paper about this to say, like, we really want to get to this level of accuracy. There's some things we need to fix as a community. So if you want to know more about that, we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think the path forward is not going to be all in popsicles or whatever the expression is.
Fair enough. Your approach uses very short columns, and I was hoping you could walk us through how you maintain accuracy.
Yeah, so I would say two kind of primary things. So one is that when you put a really small short column into an instrument that is designed for use with 50, 100, 150 millimeter columns, the peak width that you see really is largely determined by the instrument at the column and also the peak shape. And so the peaks that we deal with tend to be pretty asymmetric. They are not textbook, beautiful symmetric peaks. And so it's really important to use the first statistical moment of the peak, the center of mass, center of gravity, however you want to talk about it, as a measure of retention rather than just the time associated with the apex of the peak. Because if you just use the apex with a peak that's really asymmetric, there's going to be a significant error there. People have been using statistical moments to measure properties of peaks for 70 years. But in this context, it's, I think, really important to do that to get an accurate number. And then the other thing, which is wouldn't have anticipated at all before we started this, is that we had to find a way to deal with the fact that there's no good or easy way to measure. So when you inject a sample into a column and you watch what comes out the other end, we think about the retention time as the time it takes for the molecules to migrate through the column. But that migration time through the column includes the time to go through the frits on the ends of the columns and the stationary phase, the particle bed, so to speak. But the part we care about is through the particles, right? Because that's where the chemistry is. That's where the separation actually happens. And normally we don't think about the frits at all, I would say, because in a normal size, 100 millimeter long column, they're a very, very small contribution to the total volume between where you inject and where you detect. So we think of the frits as being on the volume on the order of a microliter or so. So 100 millimeter by 2.1 millimeter ID column is about 200 microliters inside. So the contribution of the frits is only on the order of 1%. But as you make the column very small, then the contribution of the frit volume becomes large. So these 5 millimeter by 2.1 millimeter ID columns we use are about 10-ish microliters in volume. So if you put two frits on there, now you have the frits contributing like 20% to the volume. And I think to a pretty good approximation, if you don't account for the frit volume somehow, then the error in your retention measurement is essentially the same level as the contribution of the frit to the total volume. So we had to figure out we could see this error initially. And so our idea was, instead of sort of cataloging absolute retention time, we use retention ratios because we use toluene mostly as our reference compound. And then what we record and fill our database with is a ratio of the retention of whatever compound we're interested in relative to toluene. And this has the effect of basically just totally wiping out this error due to the frit volume. There are probably other things you can do, but we found that this is very effective, works really well. It's easy to do. So that's our approach.
That's great. Could you explain why this approach is more robust for building large databases?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think what you're referring to is in one of our first papers on this, we just compared let's say, the variation in absolute retention factor for something like toluene. We just compared that to the variation over time, so over days, over months, to the variation over a longer time in this selectivity or retention factor ratio. We just see in the data that the selectivity is much more stable. To be honest, we don't really know why this is. I think we could, anybody doing this work could design or make a list of possible reasons, but we've just never really taken the time to dig into it because we we think we need to use this selectivity ratio anyway to deal with the frit problem I just described. And so that's going to be our approach. And it turns out that that measure of retention or selectivity is much more stable anyway. So We're on the good side of that. And I think it could be, short-term variations in temperature, lab temperature, could be short-term variations in how exactly the pump is preparing the mobile phase. So how consistent is that from day to day and over months? Those would probably be the two biggest things we would look at initially, but we've honestly just never taken the time.
Your HSM3 model represents a significant advancement over previous hydrophobic subtraction models. What key insights emerged from having that sheer amount of data, the 43,000 tension measurements that you had cited?
Yeah, so maybe just backing up a little bit to the evolution of the story for us. Initially, we looked at the sort of predictive accuracy of the original HSM, not very good. And we did the refinement to produce HSM2, that was much better. And then around that same time, we had a company approach us to wondering about if we could use HSM to, let's say, track or try to understand the chemistry of changes in selectivity of a given column over time. So you could call it stationary phase degradation. And we tried that and it didn't work very well. And the model was just like, there's nothing going on here. Even though if you look at actual separations of particular molecules, you can clearly see that the selectivity is changing. It turns out the particular separation we were interested in was a separation of isomers. In the set of 15 molecules that are used to characterize columns with the HSM, so the original model, there's there's only one isomer pair there, and that pair of molecules is relatively small. So we had some other clues at that point that we needed more data for isomers if we want the model to say anything about isomers. In the 43,000 measurements, one of the things we did is deliberately put into the probe set there several isomer pairs, and then one of our big questions in that HSM3 was, does this help in terms of improving predictive accuracy for an HSM like molecule model for isomer pairs? And the answer was, I think, pretty convincingly yes. To me, that's pretty exciting because what the folks who run method development labs in pharma would tell me, at least, is that something like 80% of separations that they deal with are relatively easy. They can do them using their favorite C18, whatever that is. It varies from company to company, and they don't have to try very hard. They have so much experience with how to approach that they can just knock them out pretty quickly. But the 20% that remains is more challenging. Very often, the reason they're challenging is because of isomer separations. So to me, this is like one of the big nuts we need to crack. For something to be as impactful as we want it to be, it has to address separations of isomers. So so that was a big focus at that time, and that was pretty encouraging. Of course, we continue to think we would benefit from more data, but that was a big realization. One of the things we talked about in that paper is the idea that because we have these models that have components in the model, if you just look at the equations, we have a term in the equation that has something to do with the size of the molecule. We have a term in the equation that has something to do with the way molecules that are ionized interact with some part of the stationary phase that's ionized. And so we said, well, can we use this connection between the pieces of the model and the chemistry to say something about, if I just take any two molecules, ask why they separate, why do they separate? Because I've been doing liquid chromatography for going on 30 years, which is hard to believe. But if you show me a chromatogram and say, these are two molecules, they separate, why? And especially compared to these other two molecules, which are kind of similar and they don't separate, what's the difference? I can't tell you. And I think most people can't. We kind of say, well, it could be this or it could be that. And we think maybe this, but I think people don't really know. There's a lot of hand waving and guesswork and inappropriate amounts of us thinking we know more than we do. So, but we have these models where we have these connections between the chemistry. And so what we try to do is sort of parse that out and say, okay, here's two molecules that separate. They're actually isomers. Why do they separate? And we could clearly see, okay, for I think it was dinitrophenol was the pair of isomers that we looked at. Most of the contributions to selectivity in the model are actually the same, but it's one or two terms that really make the difference. And so to me, this is super exciting because if we can do that with even more precision, then I think we can actually begin to understand more about why certain separations work and or certain separations happen. And uh, I'm as someone who works in the details most of the time. I really believe that if we understand more about how it works, we can design better in the future, right? So I'm pretty excited about that. I think it provides a chance for us to really understand more at the molecular level why some separations work and some don't. The other thing I would say in terms of what we learned from that kind of that era, that exercise was quite a bit about some of the limitations that we're going to encounter. So I mentioned this before, so I'll just mention two of them now. So if you just go into the lab, you put in a sort of normal size column and you make some retention measurements. These days, with a modern instrument, you can expect a relative standard deviation in retention on the order of 0.1% easily, or sometimes much better. But when you make the absolute retention measurement very small, which is what we're doing to get the throughput, then the relative variation really goes up a lot. And so now we kind of expect from from measurement to measurement, day to day, something in the neighborhood of 1 to 2%, which is not fantastic, right? We'd like it to be just as good in relative terms as what we experience with normal size columns. And so that's kind of like the blinding light in our face. And we're starting to understand, I think, what are the big sources of that variation and have some ideas about how to improve that going forward. So that's currently a limitation of the approach. Basically, you can go fast and you can get retention data in a high throughput manner, but to some extent, you trade speed for precision in the retention data. So, like I said, I think there's a path forward to do much better than what we're capable of doing now, but that's going to take some effort. And the other big thing that we saw is that some stationary phases drift pretty badly over time. So if you go in a lab today and measure selectivities of 50 molecules, and then you put that column in a box and come back a month later, do it again, put it in a box, come back a month later, do it again. Some molecules are just absolutely, or some columns are absolutely rock solid. Like there's no statistical difference in the data we get today, next month, 2 months from now. But some columns are really drifty, really bad. To me, I kind of chuckle because I did a lot of this selectivity measurement stuff when I was in graduate school. And at the time, I thought, oh, 100 measurements is a big data set. And I thought, oh, you measure once and you have it forever. But if you have a phase that's drifting, then what are you putting in your database? Are you putting in the database data from yesterday or 2 weeks from now? And if it's just a point in time and it's not the same every time, then that's a huge problem, right? It's going to lead to inaccuracies later on. This is a big challenge. Number one, we don't know which ones are the problematic ones because I love the manufacturers, but they're not going to tell you, right? In the catalog, it's not going to be like gold star column doesn't drift. Um, Number one, we don't know. And number two, what do we do about it? Because if we just take the situation as it is now and we say, well, we don't want drifty columns, then it's going to really reduce the scope of whatever model comes out. It might, again, we don't know for sure, but my hunch is that we would find that the more, let's say, non C18, plain vanilla C18 like the chemistry is, the worse it is, generally speaking. And so if we say we don't want drift in our data, then it's going to really reduce the chemical diversity in the data set and reduce the scope. The other solution, of course, is to make better materials. And I worked in the column industry for 3.5 years. I understand that's a big challenge, but I think we as a community have a choice. We can say, no, we're just going to take the materials we have, build the best model we can, and that's it. Or we can say, no, this is really important to us, this model building thing as a community. And to do that, we need materials that aren't drifty. So we're going to make them. But I don't think any one manufacturer is just going to go off and do that on their own. It's going to have to be a community realization to say this is a big priority, has to be a big priority for us to advance the science. And this is how we're going to tackle it. So that's a real challenging one. I don't see anybody talking about this really at all. If you look at all of the papers being published in the MLAI space around retention prediction, I don't think anybody's talking about it at all. But it's real for sure.
And I think someone should run with that slogan.
No more drifty columns.
We did the marketing project already.
Yeah, there you go.
What advice would you give to young researchers who are really interested in the chromatography side and on the data science side and kind of merging those?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my sense, and I have this conversation with students a fair amount. So, first of all, what I tell students is I think most of the exciting stuff in my lifetime is going to happen at these interfaces between the traditional fields, right? So, whether that's the interface between chemistry and biology, or chemistry and physics, or physics and biology, you're talking about chromatography and data science. I think the same thing is true here. And I think what I see in the other cases that's also true here is I don't think you can just have expertise in one of those areas and be functional at the interface. I think for you to be really effective at the interface, you have to have baseline functional knowledge and expertise in both areas. So again, when I talk with students about this, like if a student's interested in chemistry and physics, I say, are you a chemist first or a physicist first? Right? Because they're different. You can be a chemist who's very interested in physics and work in a space where you can do both things. But the kinds of jobs and the research questions you tackle with that mindset are very different from if you say, I'm a physicist first and I'm going to work on chemical problems. Again, here in the space we're talking about, I think you can absolutely be a chromatographer first and work on research questions that involve a lot of data and having to have some expertise in data science or statistics. But that's very, very different from being a data scientist first who works on chromatography problems. And what I see is people trying to work in the interface without enough knowledge in one of those areas. I think I'm actually an example of this. I'm trying to work in this interface, but I don't know enough data science or statistics to be as effective as I could be in this space. So that's on me. It's not, it takes time. But the other way is true, right? You can be the world's best data scientist, but if you don't know things like that it's nonsense to talk about retention factors that are negative, you can spend days and months just producing garbage because you don't know those basic things, right? And like the person that I know that sort of fits this bill, I mentioned her before, Sarah Rutan. She's technically retired now, but we keep asking her to do things. She was trained as essentially a statistician. I mean, she her focus in graduate school was statistics, but then when she got into her academic career, she spent a lot of time learning about chromatography. So I would say she probably wouldn't say that she's a chromatographer, but she knows a lot. And so she can walk down the hall and talk to a statistician and understand what they're telling her at a high level. And she can walk down the hall and talk to me about chromatography and really, you know, understand the details. And I think the work that we've done on HSM2 and HSM3 and the work that we're continuing to do now has really been driven a lot by her in terms of dealing with the data because she can speak both languages pretty effectively. So, yeah, unfortunately, I think there's no, if you buy this line of thinking, then the unfortunate reality is it takes time to develop that expertise in both areas. But I think it's worth it because someone who can do that will be much more effective than everyone else that's trying to work in that space.
I suppose that's why it's challenging to be great because you're taking expertise from a couple different key areas where,
Yeah.
yeah. I know we covered a lot of ground today, trying to touch on some summary topics from three different pieces of research, but was there anything we missed that you wanted to touch on?
Not really, not any specific thing. I think yes, for people that are listening to this that are interested, I would just say that I think what we're talking about here again, I think is really one of the holy grails of chromatography, and it's not going to be simple. It's not going to be quick. I think it's sort of high effort, high reward, and I don't think any one research group is going to totally crack this. I think it's really going to take lots of people contributing and trying to move it along. So I would say if there's people out there that are interested to just get in the conversation because we need lots of good ideas and we need a lot of data. And one of the things we're focusing on, I would say, starting to focus on with the conversations we're having with people who want to contribute data is how do we harmonize? Because again, if we want model that's accurate to a level of 1, 2, 3% prediction error, then we have to have data in the database, in the data set that's sort of compatible at that level. That is, if I make measurements in my lab and you make measurements in your lab on your instrument with your columns, are they sort of equivalent or compatible? Because if they're not, then we're just introducing noise into the data set, and the quality of the model that we get is going to reflect that. So, and unfortunately, I think the biggest problem we're going to have to deal with is mobile phase preparation. So, exactly what mobile phase are we going to use, and exactly how do we make it? And so we need to come to consensus as a community about what are those conditions going to be. And if you survey people and say, we're going to build a model, what should the mobile phase be? You get lots of different opinions, some of which are held very strongly. So how do you move people off of that, right? So again, the point is, if you're interested, get involved in the conversation. I'm starting to see now pretty much, I'd say all of the major conferences, HPLC meeting, PidCon, EIS, and so on, are all having sessions dedicated to work in this space. So it's not hard to find the people who are interested in doing the work. But again, I think we all collectively will benefit from making this more of a group effort than some things we've done in the past. We could call it our Manhattan Project. Manhattan Project of Chromatography. How about that?
Sounds like high difficulty, but well worth it, high reward.
Yeah, I think so.
Absolutely. Well, thanks. I really appreciate it. And I hope to run into you at ACS or whatever event you're at next.
All right, sounds good. Thanks again for the invite.